You know that feeling when you meet someone, and while they're introducing themselves, you're just so busy planning your own response that you completely miss their name, right? Or maybe you've totally zoned out during a conversation, just kind of nodding along politely while your mind is literally miles away. Well, don't worry, you are definitely not alone there. Today's explainer is all about a hidden superpower that honestly most of us desperately need to cultivate. Ernest Hemingway actually hit the nail right on the head when he said, "When people talk, listen completely. Most people never listen." It's so true, isn't it? We hear words, sure, but listening completely? Man, that's an entirely different beast. So let's dive into this. We're going to unpack the science, the history, and the absolute necessity of active listening. And as you'll see, it is way, way more than just a generic soft skill.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The art of listening. 2. The neuroscience of connection. 3. Diffusing crises with listening. 4. Listening is medicine. 5. The limits of listening. And 6. Training your listening muscle. We're basically going on a deep dive from brain chemistry all the way to hostage negotiations and hospital bedsides.
Let's kick things off with part 1, the art of listening, tracing the clinical origins.
Okay, let's look at where this whole concept actually came from. Because it's not just some trendy corporate buzzword, it's actually got deep, evidence-based roots. Back in the 1940s, clinical psychologist Carl Rogers started digging into what made certain counselors just so incredibly effective at helping clients with personal problems. And their secret, they listened far more than they talked. Up until then, standard practice was to, ask probing questions, analyze, judge, give advice. But then, in 1957, Rogers and Richard Farson officially coined the term active listening. They described it as literally getting inside the speaker's perspective to grasp exactly what they're communicating. A few years later, in 1962, Rogers' colleague Thomas Gordon took the concept mainstream. He popularized it in a modern parenting program called Parent Effectiveness Training.
Moving on to part 2, the neuroscience of connection, biologically rewiring the brain. So, what's the physical reality of what happens inside our loud, distracted brains when we actually manage to quiet them down and focus entirely on someone else? Well, our brains are inherently social. When we actively listen, we fire up our mirror neurons. These are what allow us to recognize kindred spirits, connect intuitively on a much deeper level, and actually learn from the shared experiences of others. It's like building a cognitive bridge. And while those neurons are doing their thing, oxytocin, which is often called the trust hormone, floods our system. That reinforces deep emotional bonds and creates this palpable warmth between communicators. You're not just hearing sound waves here. You are biologically syncing up with another human being. How cool is that?
Which brings us to Section 3, diffusing crises with listening and high-stakes negotiations. Let's really crank up the intensity for a second. What happens when active listening isn't just about interpersonal bonding, but literally about life and death? The FBI actually has a behavioral change stairway model for crisis negotiation, used in hostage and suicide situations. And notice step 1, active listening. You literally cannot reach step 5, behavioral change, without starting right there. You have to actively listen to demonstrate empathy. That empathy builds a relationship, which then builds the minimum trust required to actually exert any influence. Influence and change are completely impossible without first disarming those intense emotions through pure, focused listening.
The core rule here, emotions first, interests second. And hey, this applies to everyday business and human resources just as much as it does to an intense crisis negotiation. Think about a really high-stress HR scenario, right? Like announcing layoffs. If a manager walks in and immediately starts quoting data, restructuring costs, and throwing out logical arguments, the conversation completely fails. Why? Because the employee's unaddressed emotions act like an unlocked grenade. By applying that FBI framework, listening and letting the individual express their emotions first, you de-escalate the tension. You provide the psychological safety that is absolutely necessary before you even attempt to solve the logistical problems.
All right, Section 4, listening as medicine, healing at the bedside. We've covered clinical origins, brain chemistry, and crisis units. But let's shift gears to the healthcare realm, where listening operates as literal medicine. 11 seconds. I just want that shocking number to sink in for a moment. A 2018 study analyzed recorded clinical encounters and found that in the rare cases when medical clinicians actually ask patients about the reason for their visit, they interrupt the patient after an average of just 11 seconds. 11 seconds!
When patients don't feel heard, the entire foundation of their care just begins to crumble.
But watch what happens when we flip the script. The Penn Medicine Listening Lab ran a thematic analysis on 41 deeply personal stories from patients and providers to really understand the impact of listening. And the biggest driver of patient satisfaction and medical adherence? Connection and trust. When patients felt actively heard, it drastically lowered their anxiety, it built a trusting relationship, and it literally improved medical outcomes. It's a real game changer.
The researchers found that empathetic listening actually gives patients permission to express vulnerability. As one provider put it, it allows people to lift up the rug they usually sweep their emotions under. This creates a safe space where patients and doctors can establish true care objectives, not just based on standard clinical pathways, but on the patient's actual lived experience and personal goals.
Now for Section 5, the limits of listening, the contrarian view.
To be totally thorough and objective here, we have to ask, is active listening a magical cure-all for absolutely every communication problem? Well, Dr. John Gottman, a highly influential relationship therapist, offers a fantastic analogy that challenges this. He strongly pushes back on the idea that active listening works in distressed marriages, and his reasoning makes a lot of sense. The listener in a marriage isn't a neutral spectator like a clinical counselor is. If one partner is expressing intense anger, the person trying to use active listening is usually the target of that exact anger. So expecting someone to neutrally parrot back complaints about themselves, that requires an Olympic-level emotional performance. As Gottman says, it expects you to swim in a pool of emotional criticism right next to Michael Phelps. So yeah, context matters immensely.
Finally, Section 6, training your listening muscle. Let's get into some practical takeaways.
Let's ramp this whole thing up with some actionable steps you can actually use, because listening isn't just a static personality trait that you either have or you don't. It's a muscle, and just like any muscle, if you don't actively work it out, it's going to atrophy. Educator Trevor Muir suggests the dream vacation exercise. Here's how it works. One person describes their ideal trip for 60 seconds without ever naming the location. They just focus purely on the weather, the food, the activities. The listener then has to perfectly summarize those details and guess the destination. Believe me, you simply cannot do that if you're zoning out. Then there's the loud brain exercise. Have a partner talk for a minute and raise your hand every single time you hear your own inner thoughts pop up. It is a hilarious and honestly humbling way to see exactly how distracted we get. And finally, from the MindWorks curriculum, the bell practice. You strike a bell or a gong and you hold your focus entirely on the sound, raising your hand only when the tone has completely 100% faded. These are all phenomenal disciplines to actively quiet the mind and train your focus.
Which brings us to our final thought, Earless Explainer. The superpower of active listening can absolutely forge trust, heal relationships, and even diffuse life or death crises. But it requires your intentional effort to put your own ego aside and truly, deeply focus. So I leave you with this challenge today. In your very next conversation, are you going to be silently planning your reply, or will you actually be listening?